Hey, and welcome back to day 3. And this is our second really in-depth look at the principles of training for building muscle. We're just going to go over some of the slightly less important but still significant training variables to explain them so you understand them, and then we can move on to the nitty-gritty details of putting together a really good muscle building plan. And so this one is fatigue management or recovery, and that's the fourth factor or fourth principle we're looking at. Now, it's important to realize you can only train as hard as you can recover from. So you need to train hard, recover harder, because as I've said before, you don't get big lifting weights, you get big recovering from lifting weights. So there's a concept of effective volume, and that's important for you to understand. Now, there's only so much work you can do per session for a given muscle group to maximize the muscle building stimulus you give it. And then after a certain point, doing more and more sets for that body part is just what we call junk volume. You're getting a stimulus that's not really causing any more beneficial effects because you've tapped out your ability to build muscle for that muscle group that day. So think of it this way: Monday, everybody changed chest. It's International Chest Day, and guys go and do 20, 30 sets worth of chest work. More than half of that is probably wasted effort, just tiring them out, causing fatigue, and in fact, maybe holding back their progress because they're doing more than they can recover from. Chances are that between 6 and 10 sets per muscle group per session is the sweet spot for you. So once you go beyond that, it's probably not worth your while, and you're affecting your ability to build muscle because you're overtraining that muscle group in that session. So also realize that across your training career, your ability to handle workload increases because, as I've said, your body adapts and it grows with you, and your capacity to handle training improves the more training you do. So early on in your career, 3 sets for a muscle group will provide a massive muscle building stimulus and will get results. Now, if you do things properly, 3-4 years later, those 3 sets, they're not going to cut it. You'll need more workload. So it's important not just to think, my favorite Instagram fitness model is doing 12 sets for his chest on a Monday. I'm going to do the same. Maybe he's been training a decade to get where he is. You might be better off down at that 3 set level, and then gradually, month on month, and then year on year, building the amount of high quality sets you're doing for that muscle group. So remember this: train hard, but recover harder. Next up, the 5th principle is periodization. Now, it's not as complicated as you think. You probably heard that, and you may think it's this super complex Soviet training system, but actually, all it means is that you have a plan in place to manipulate the key variables of volume, intensity, and frequency. Just to recap, volume is the sets times reps times load on the bar. Intensity is your percentage of 1 rep max. So if you're using 60 kilos and your 1 rep max is 100 kilos, you're using 60%. And frequency is how often you train a muscle group per week. So if you train your chest twice a week, your training frequency is 2 times a week. Now, your training should increase in demand over time. As applies to progressive overload, it needs to get harder over time. So, periodization just allows you to manipulate the variables to achieve that. It means that you can have what we call is phase potentiation, that one phase builds on the last and primes you for the next, and so on and so on and so on. So each phase of your training builds and progresses you and has an additive effect. As I bet that you've done the mistake before that I made of you kind of pinball between all these different training processes and programs, and they're not a coherent structure. There's no logical sequence, so you're not adding one on to the other. It's not a case of 1 + 1 + 1 = 3. It might be 1 + 1 + 1 + 1 + 1 = 2, because for all of those training programs, all that effort you've invested to each training session, you're really not seeing a return on investment. If you get periodization right, then you can actually have a case it's more like 1 + 1 = 4. So the way to structure that is going to be a whole video I'll do to give you detailed plan on that. But just understand, it's not as complicated as maybe you think it is, but it is important and will help you get those marginal gains that take you from having a good physique to a great physique. The 6th principle is variation. I like to call this strategic variation or directed variation. It's not muscle confusion. It's not change for sake of change. It's an element of periodization, really. And the question is, how often should you change your program? What elements do you need to change? So how often should you change exercises? How often should you change rep ranges. And this all depends on your level of advancement, whether you define yourself as a beginner, intermediate, or advanced. Now, the best way to think of this in terms of if you're not sure is if you can add weight to the bar each week, then you're still a beginner. And don't take that as a criticism. That's fantastic. People are in a rush to be advanced. Beginner gains are the fastest gains you're ever going to make. So you want to be a beginner as much as possible. If I could make gains at a beginner rate and go back there, that'd be phenomenal. But if you're adding weight to the bar on an exercise each week, you're a beginner. If it takes you about a month to see a noticeable increase, so for example, say you can bench press 100 kilos, to be able to go to being, for 5 reps, to be able to go to 102.5 for 5 reps consistently, or say 3 sets of 5 in week 1, and a month later you can do 3 sets of 5, but you've added 2.5 kilos, then you're probably an intermediate. It takes about a month for you to have a confident increase in weight gain on the bar. An advanced lifter takes much more time. If you think of this as a power lifter preparing for a competition, so they have to squat, bench press and deadlift, they might have an entire 12-week block of training just to be able to see an extra 2.5, maybe 5 kilos on their squat. And then if it's taking you several months to see that change, you're advanced. Now, while it seems cool to be advanced, just bear in mind that the rate of gain is much, much slower. So don't be shy in classifying yourself as a beginner if that's where you are. Embrace it, enjoy it, and get great gains. Now, most of the variation you're going to have for hypertrophy is going to be about exercise selection and rep ranges. Now, the reason we need to change things is because you have adaptive resistance, which is basically the law of diminishing returns. Because your body adapts, every time it's given the same stimulus, the level of adaptation required gets smaller and smaller and smaller. So the magnitude of effect from your training becomes a little bit smaller until the point at which really you're doing the same exercise for the same sets and reps with basically the same weight, and it's not forcing the body to adapt. And that's when you need to make some changes. Knowing when to make those changes is a bit of a skill. There's an art to it as well as a science. But it's a valuable element to maximising your progress. And I have a specific video on variation and how to do it, and how to choose what exercises for each body part and how to sequence them for the best gains month on month. So keep your eyes peeled for that video. And finally is individual difference, which I've listed as the 7th principle here for you to look at when it comes to the scientific principles of training. And you might be thinking, oh, well, my program needs to be specific to me. It should be the most important thing. And I can kind of see your point. Yes and no. Your training should be specific to you, and you are special and different and unique. You are a special snowflake. The point is that you're not that special. All of the previous 6 principles still apply to everyone. We're all humans. Our physiology is more similar than it is different. And so we have those 6 guiding principles before this that make sure they're in place, and then we individualize your program to maximize your results. You pick the variables that suit you best, because the long and the short of it is you shouldn't be training exactly the same as your training partner, because he's probably not the same height, weight, age, training experience, previous injuries, sporting background, limb lengths relative to his torso, for example, are not all exactly the same. Their ability to recover won't be the same because they might have more or less stress than you. So we have the training principles in place, and then you take those and make them into little programming decisions and protocols that suit you. But you must have the basics in place first before you start to worry about individualizing things. Because if you just put individualization first, you can miss the wood for the trees and not end up with a specific program that is progressively overloading you. And that means that you won't make great results, even though you might have the best exercise for you. If the rest of the framework's not in place, you're not going to build as much muscle as possible. So your training shouldn't be identical to somebody else, because you are different, but you're not radically different. If someone else was looking at the 2 programs, they should probably be more similar when they look at them than they are different. But there are some subtle differences to maximize your results. And I'll talk in another video in detail about how you can individualize your training program.